If you ever got dragged into court, you probably already know this. The books that really scare a government are not always the ones openly calling for revolution. Sometimes the most dangerous book is the one that looks quiet, the one that does not scream, the one that just sits there, cool and precise, and describes reality a little too well. In 1857, the French government went after a novel that did not contain a king's assassination, a street uprising, or some hero yelling about tearing down the old world. It was simply about a provincial doctor's wife. She wanted love. She was disappointed by marriage. She dreamed of a more beautiful life. Then, step by step, she turned her own life into a disaster. On paper, that sounds almost absurdly small. A woman cheats on her husband. Why would a whole state get nervous over that? And yet France did get nervous enough to put Gustave Flaubert on trial. Even stranger, the same novel that was once accused of corrupting public morals later became one of the monuments of world literature. That usually means one thing. The official explanation was not the real explanation. The authorities said the novel was immoral. Later readers said it was truthful. So the real question is not whether Madame Bovary tells a story about adultery. The real question is what exactly this novel revealed that made a nation so eager to punish it. How did a story about private desire turn into a public trial about literature, morality, state power, and modern longing? Welcome to my channel. This is To the Lighthouse. Today we are talking about what was truly frightening behind the censorship trial of Madame Bovary. On the surface, it looks like a scandal. A novel about an unfaithful wife angers the court. But once you peel that layer off, you realize that the defendant was not just Flaubert, and not just Emma Bovary either. What was really on trial was realism itself, a novel in court. The story begins with serialization. In 1856, Madame Bovary first appeared in the Revue de Paris. Now, French literary culture at the time was hardly fragile. Stendhal had already written The Red and the Black, a novel full of ambition, desire, and class anxiety. Balzac had gone even further in La Comédie Humaine, turning French society into a vast machine made of greed, dreams, calculation, vanity, and mutual consumption. Victor Hugo in Notre Dame de Paris, and later Les Miserables, had already exposed poverty, hypocrisy, and the violence hidden inside respectable institutions. Across Europe, Goethe had given us The Sorrows of Young Werther. Byron had wrapped danger in romantic glamour. Dickens in Oliver Twist had stripped away London's polite face, and later Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment would set the human mind on fire from the inside. 19th century literature was already becoming more daring, more disobedient, more interested in the mess of human life, and still, Madame Bovary caused a scandal. Why? Because it was not simply about a woman committing adultery. It was about the way that life was narrated. It used a tone so cool, so steady, so uninterested in comforting anyone, that the novel felt less like a sermon and more like an exposure. The prosecution quickly charged Flaubert with offending public and religious morality. And here is where it gets really interesting. Flaubert was not some theatrical provocateur making money from outrage. He was not a pamphleteer, not a tabloid sensationalist, not a literary troublemaker living off scandal. Quite the opposite. He was obsessive about style, to an almost pathological degree. He could rewrite a paragraph again and again just to get the rhythm of a sentence right. He later became famous for the ideal of le mot juste, the exact word. A writer like that ending up in court for immorality tells you immediately that the problem was never just the presence of sexual material. The novel had touched a deeper nerve. To understand that nerve, we have to understand the France that put Flaubert on trial. 19th century France had already passed through the Revolution, the Napoleonic Empire, the Bourbon Restoration, the July Monarchy, and the Revolution of 1848. By the time of Flaubert's trial, the country was under Napoleon III and the Second Empire. It was a period that looked polished from the outside and deeply anxious on the inside. Paris was being modernized. Streets were being rebuilt. Consumer culture was growing. The bourgeoisie felt more confident than ever about its lifestyle, its values, its good taste, its belief in order. But the prettier the surface became, the more effort it took to maintain that surface. News had to be managed, publishing had to be watched, opinion had to be shaped. Society had to remain stable. Ideally, even people's inner fantasies had to stay within acceptable limits. That is why the Second Empire did not want literature scraping the paint off the walls. It wanted order, family, morality, respectability, and a society that looked as if everyone could be properly guided toward the correct feelings. Madame Bovary did the exact opposite. It did not celebrate virtue, progress, or heroism. It wrote about boredom, marital boredom, provincial boredom, the gap between desire and reality. The way a person can slowly be eaten alive by her own fantasies, to a government, that can be more irritating than a direct attack. If you criticize the regime openly, at least the enemy is visible. Flaubert did something much worse. He made society look at the parts of itself it most wanted to avoid. When Emma Bovary first enters the story, she does not look like a revolutionary threat. She is a woman from a fairly respectable background, educated in a convent, married to Charles Bovary, a country doctor. She lives in the provinces, with an honest but dull husband, a life that is not poor but certainly not elegant, and the kind of future that should have been perfectly acceptable according to the script of the age. She is supposed to become a respectable wife, a conventional mother, and spend a lifetime moving between the kitchen, the bedroom, the church, and the household accounts. The problem is that Emma refuses. She is not a born rebel in the political sense. She is more like someone whose appetite has been ruined by literature. The romantic novels she read in the convent filled her with images of grand passion, noble suffering, aristocratic interiors, midnight vows, fatal love, and a life charged with destiny. She expected life to feel like a novel. She expected love to arrive like a storm. She expected marriage to sound like music. She expected to be the central figure in a story illuminated by fate. Instead, reality handed her a husband who yawns, one mediocre dinner after another, a house that is never beautiful enough, and days that refuse to become dramatic. If Cervantes gave us Don Quixote, drunk on chivalric romances and charging at windmills with a lance, then Flaubert gave us Emma Bovary, drunk on romantic fiction and charging into reality in a dress. Don Quixote is funny in a way that makes you smile. Emma is frightening in a way that tightens something inside you, because she feels so modern. What she wants is not simply a man. What she wants is the feeling that her life has finally become worthy of fiction. She is not really in love with specific people so much as with the atmosphere of love, the glow it casts over existence. Even her spending is not just material greed. It is an attempt to decorate life until it resembles the fantasy in her head. In other words, she is not just naive. She is an early inhabitant of the modern world of consumer desire and emotional illusion, not erotica, but reality. And this is exactly what makes Flaubert so unsettling. He does not write Emma as the traditional immoral woman from a cautionary tale. She is not some naturally depraved seductress, not a cartoon villain wrecking domestic order, not a convenient object for readers to condemn and then leave feeling morally superior. She is complex, fragile, vain, empty, sensitive, self-absorbed, hungry to be rescued, and at the same time, constantly pushing herself deeper into the hole. She reads novels, attends a ball, begins to despise her husband, enters a relationship with Rodolphe, later renews her feelings with Léon, lies, borrows, performs, spends, and eventually collapses. Throughout all this, Flaubert never does what the court wanted him to do. He never stands next to her with a loudspeaker yelling, "Look, children, this is the price of adultery." He simply traces the curve of self-destruction and lets the reader feel it. That is the central thorn in the censorship case. The authorities were not shocked because literature had dared to represent sin. Literature had always represented sin. Greek tragedy gave the world incest and murder within the family. Shakespeare gave us conspiracy, jealousy, lust, betrayal, and slaughter. Molière exposed hypocrisy. Racine wrote desire with terrifying elegance. Goethe gave passion its fever. Hugo descended into poverty and social injustice. Balzac showed money eating the human soul. These were not nursery books. The issue was never whether literature could depict what is bad. The issue was how it depicted it. The state could tolerate vice if vice was properly packaged inside moral instruction. A character may fall, but the author must make the lesson unmistakable. The text must behave like a parent at a school meeting. Dear children, do not imitate this. The consequences are terrible, Flaubert refused. His most radical move was not Emma's adultery. It was the form of the narration. He used what later critics would repeatedly discuss as free, indirect discourse. The narrative voice slides quietly into Emma's consciousness. As you read, you realize you are no longer standing outside her life. You are drifting inside her perceptions. Her boredom when she looks at the curtains, her feverish memories of the ball, her grandiose self-intoxication in front of her lover, her delusion that luxury purchases somehow prove destiny has finally recognized her worth. All of this reaches the reader in a strangely intimate way, yet at the same time, the author never fully merges with her. A slight distance remains. That is the brilliance of it. We understand her and see through her at once. We are drawn into the dream and made aware of how flimsy, dangerous, and absurd the dream really is. Governments do not tend to love that kind of reading experience. Didactic literature is safe. It behaves like a school principal. It helps the state manage morality. Flaubert's prose does not manage morality. It does not perform judgment in advance. It does not write the correct answer on the board before the reader has even finished the question. It demands that readers feel for themselves, judge for themselves, assemble meaning for themselves. And a reader who starts doing that is not always the easiest citizen. That is why Madame Bovary was prosecuted. On the surface, the charge was obscenity. In truth, the danger was that the novel refused to cooperate with the machinery of moral packaging. The prosecutor, Ernest Pinard, followed a logic that now looks very revealing. He did not say literature could never depict moral corruption. He said that if corruption is depicted, it must be clearly condemned. What he wanted was not reality. He wanted domesticated reality. Reality shown briefly, under supervision, and then returned to proper ideological control. The state was not afraid of evil being mentioned. The state was afraid of evil being written as if it were simply part of life. That is why Flaubert stands at such an important turning point in 19th-century European literature. Balzac had already made Paris feel like a machine that grinds together fatherly love, ambition, and youth in Père Goriot. Stendhal in The Red and the Black had already shown Julian Sorel smashing into the invisible wall of class society. Dickens in Bleak House, Oliver Twist, and A Tale of Two Cities made industrial and urban misery impossible to ignore politely. Hugo, when he wrote Jean Valjean, was not just offering a sentimental tale of goodness, he was asking whether law and justice are really the same thing. Later, Tolstoy and Anna Karenina would give us another woman trapped between social order and inner desire. Dostoevsky would push Raskolnikov to the edge of moral and psychological breakdown. Ibsen would make Nora shut the door in A Doll's House, and that door slam would echo through the European middle-class drawing room. Flaubert was not an isolated case. He was part of a broader literary movement toward reality. But he was also especially merciless. Balzac can be exuberant. Dickens can be morally warm. Hugo often raises emotion like an orchestra. Dostoevsky boils the soul under pressure. Flaubert is colder like a surgical instrument, and that kind of calm is often more offensive than anger. Anger invites rebuttal. Calm can feel like judgment. Emma and Us. The reason Emma Bovary became such an explosive figure in literary history is that she does not feel remote. She is not a queen, not a political heroine, not some legendary femme fatale. She is just an ordinary person who cannot bear the shape of her own life. She longs for greater emotional intensity, a more elevated way of living, a more dramatic image of herself. She does not want to be merely Charles Bovary's wife. She wants to be the woman passionately loved, struck by fate, living at the center of a heightened existence. There is something a little ridiculous about that, but also something painfully familiar. Because many people do not truly want a particular person. They want the feeling of becoming the main character once desire shines on them. That is why Madame Bovary remains uncomfortable to read. Not because it is morally outrageous, but because it is accurate. It diagnosed a modern condition before modernity had fully learned to name it. Emma turns life into an aesthetic project. She treats desire as identity construction. She uses consumption as emotional pain relief. She imagines romantic love as the last elevator out of mediocrity. Every bill she runs up feels like a life support system for her fantasy. Every man she falls for is, in part, less a man than an exit. A temporary opening through which she can escape the suffocating boredom of her world. Seen from this angle, Flaubert was not really writing about adultery. He was writing about the making of the modern self, and the way that self gets devoured by its own appetites. Emma is the child of several forces at once: romanticism, bourgeois respectability, provincial dullness, consumer temptation, literary fantasy. She is not a bad seed. She is the fruit of an entire historical soil. And that is why the trial became a watershed in literary history. The court seemed to be judging a novel, but underneath that it was asking a much larger question. Is literature supposed to teach people how to behave, or is it supposed to describe human beings as they really are? Must the author help society maintain decorum? Can a novel be loyal to form and truth without first asking permission from church, state, and family morality? Flaubert was ultimately acquitted. That sounds like literature won and the government lost. But the reality was more fragile than that. It would be more accurate to say that literature, in modern society, managed to carve out a little breathing room for itself. Not long afterward, the same prosecutor, Pinard, went after Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal. If Flaubert exposed the hollowness of bourgeois domestic life, Baudelaire turned the rotting perfume of the modern city into poetry. The result was another moral panic. Then came Zola and naturalism, bringing still more social mud into literature. Later Joyce, D.H., Lawrence, Kafka, and many others would run into the same problem in different forms. Whenever literature insists on moving closer to reality, power sooner or later gets uncomfortable. Because reality without flattering filters is rarely polite company. Looking back now, the most ironic part is that what the French state tried to suppress became canonical. What once looked dangerous became foundational to the modern novel. What was accused of corrupting morality became a masterpiece taught across generations. History has a strange habit of conducting its own appeal process, and this time the later verdict seems fairly clear. The truly indecent thing was not Emma. It was the demand that literature tell the truth while wearing gloves. That said, Emma should not be romanticized into some clean symbol of liberation. She is not a poster child for female emancipation, and she is not simply a victim. She is vain. She can be cruel. She is cold toward her daughter. She uses other people emotionally. She is no moral ideal, but that is exactly why she has literary value. Perfect people belong on monuments. Complicated people belong in novels. Flaubert's genius lies in the fact that he neither sanitizes Emma nor demonizes her. He lets her exist in all her disturbing wholeness. She is absurd and pitiable, self-absorbed and empty, shaped by her age and constantly feeding the fire herself. She becomes a mirror in which later generations can keep recognizing themselves. If we widen the frame, the scandal around Madame Bovary is structurally richer than it first appears. On the surface, it is a story of adultery. Underneath it lies 19th century French censorship and state anxiety. Beneath that lies bourgeois family morality and its demand that every individual perform respectability. Deeper still lies the way romanticism inflated personal desire, only for social reality to bankrupt that desire almost immediately. And at the deepest layer, we find the subtle hostility between the modern state and modern literature. The state wants narratives that help stabilize order. Literature has a habit of illuminating whatever inside that order is least stable. That is why an affair story could frighten a government. What the government feared was never just sex. It feared that readers might suddenly realize that respectable marriages can be hollow, provincial life can be suffocating, consumerism can function almost like religion, love can become a form of self-hypnosis, and the moral language society speaks so confidently is often just wrapping paper. The real scandal was not Emma's infidelity. The real scandal was that Flaubert made visible the cracks inside a society that kept insisting it was whole. Why it still hurts in that sense, Madame Bovary is not a novel that teaches people to become bad. It is a novel that refuses to help its era hide its ugliness, and books like that are often more dangerous than openly ideological books. A slogan asks you to take a side. A novel makes you feel that you are already living inside the problem. That is one reason I personally like this novel so much. It is ruthless, but not shallow. It is psychologically sharp, without becoming preachy. And every time I come back to Flaubert, I have the same thought. This man understood the humiliations of desire almost too well. He understood the embarrassing gap between the life we imagine and the life we can actually inhabit. That gap is where Emma lives. It is also where a lot of modern people still live. Emma Bovary was not simply losing her mind in some distant 19th century province. Her shadow keeps returning. It appears in people who treat romance as salvation, consumption as identity, and an ideal life as a set of accessories that can somehow be purchased and assembled. In a deeper sense, Flaubert was not writing only about his own century. He was writing about anyone who gets dragged forward by fantasy and then crashes face first into reality. So when the French government asked why this book was dangerous, readers today might answer very differently. Precisely because it was so accurate, how could it possibly be safe? Thanks for watching the video. If you liked the video, please subscribe. See you at the next lighthouse.